Oh, a moment we've been waiting for. Well, maybe just me and Max, but a moment that we've certainly been waiting for. It's time for the quarterback spreadsheet. You see him right there, Matt Hasselbeck. He's the man that we're going to talk about today, number 50 on the quarterback spreadsheet. And here are the two guys that are going to talk about it. Max McDoulan, Lucas Moore. We've got the NFL Films music rolling, Max. It's a beautiful day. We are going through the quarterback formula, which you helped me develop and hone and make our own and discuss over numerous cell phone conversations and text conversations. And shout out Chrislyn Gain, who helped develop the actual spreadsheet to where we can type in the math and make it super easy. I don't want to show the whole spreadsheet because it kind of ruins the whole flow of the show, but we're going to have plenty of time to discuss all the things that went into it, what we decided to do with it, how it eliminates bias, how it compares eras, and we get to dive into the history of quarterbacks, which you and I do a lot of the times anyway.
Yeah, no, it's really exciting. And the whole point of it is that it's an opportunity to quantify these athletes in a really great way. And I think that's going to be a lot of fun because there are these constant debates time and time again over someone's significance and over someone's impact. But this is an opportunity for us to actually quantify it and then also look at the qualitative concept of it as well. What could have gone differently? What made them the individual that they were? What were the challenges that they faced? And I think that's what's most exciting for me is it's an excuse to talk about 50 great athletes who are one of the greatest players at their position in their game in a sport that we all love. So that's the fun part, right? The list is one thing and the arguments about who belongs where is another, but just getting to talk about these guys and what their different makeups are and how there is a different makeup for so many of the different quarterbacks in the top 50. That's the most fun part here.
Yeah, and we're going to explain it real quick. I've done live streams in the past, and I'll probably do a full video explaining everything about the formula and why I did it. But let's just look at what the formula is. I mean, that's where I want to start because we have to know where are we getting our points here. So this is the quarterback formula, the all-time quarterback formula. We wanted to figure out how do we rank the greatest players at the position of quarterback. And we've typed in 128 of the most successful quarterbacks in the Super Bowl era using these point totals. So it's all pretty self-explanatory, Max. I did the math. 67% of the achievements of the points, rather, are individual. And then the other 37% are team, which I think is a fair split for the quarterback position. I mean, about 37% is what you contribute. The league leader bonus is the only thing I really have to explain, which is it's touchdown, yards, rate, completion percentage, and adjusted yards per attempt. If you're first in the NFL in any of those categories, you get a 5-point bonus for that season. So Joe Burrow, for example, I know I always talk about Joe Burrow, whatever, it's on the Coney page, but he got 2 league leader bonuses this year for yards per attempt, completion percentage, right? So whoever led in touchdowns this year gets a league leader bonus. And that's a way to compare eras. What you notice in here, Max, no counting stats either. No counting stats. So we're all this is how we compare to eras because
and that's one of the
Bradshaw split down the middle, touchdown interceptions.
Well, and that's the whole point, right? Is that we're trying to break down and compare eras. So someone who threw for 50,000 yards in the modern era of football, how do you compare them to someone who, led the league in countless categories in the 60s and the 70s, but their career total at the end of their career was 27,000 passing yards. So that's kind of the point of that, right? And it's one of my favorite parts of the formula, along with the point that whoever wins the most, that's what really matters in the end.
Yeah, but again, it's not everything. I mean,
no,
Dan Marino's still very high. Aaron Rodgers only won Super Bowl, still very high on the list. So,
these guys are all right where I think they should be too. So the formula must be working.
As we unveil this formula and as people see it, I think the rankings nailed it. Now, we didn't set out to make a ranking and then formula to the ranking. We didn't made the formula. And speaking of the formula, it spits out our man, our boy, Matthew Hasselbeck, Matt Hasselbeck, who has one of the weirdest names to pronounce because I don't know if it's Hasselbeck or Hasselbeck.
It's Hasselbeck, baby. It's Matt Hasselbeck, baby.
Just say it fast.
Be profound with it.
So here's the look at Mr. Matt. 1999 to 2015 is a career scope, played for the Packers, didn't really play for the Packers, got traded to the Seahawks, where Mike Holmgren switched. He switched with Mike Holmgren, had a lot of success in Seattle, finished his career in Tennessee and Indianapolis, where he had some seasons. There's his career accomplishments. You see the points as 143. For reference, Tom Brady is at the top of the list. I don't think that's a spoiler, that Tom Brady's the greatest quarterback of all time. He's at 984 points. So that's the difference between number 50 and number 1. But just for context, it's 143. Points per season is 13. For context for Brady, Brady's up at 49. And Mahomes is number 1. He's at 57. So that's your context for Matt Hasselbeck. And that kicks off our conversation, Matt. Matt, everything, right? Number 50.
Well, you're normally doing podcasts with a guy named Matt, and we're talking about a guy named Matt today. So you've also got that going on there.
So that's
okay.
The first thing I want to do, Max, is I want to talk about the players around Matt Hasselbeck to basically give us that context. So I'll pull up the quarterback spreadsheet and give you the 5 players behind Matt Hasselbeck and then the 5 players above. So it's a little bit of a spoiler for our list, but I don't really care. The 5 players below, Max, you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Cam Newton at 51, Drew Bledsoe at 52, Steve McNair at 53, Brad Johnson at 54, and Joe Flacco at 55. So Brad Johnson and Cam Newton have higher points per season, but they just didn't play long enough. And Steve McNair is almost at the exact same points per season, even though he has an MVP. So those are the 5 players behind him. The 5 players in front, Randall Cunningham, who has 20 points per season, which is really high. So Cunningham being at 49, when we break him down, that's going to be a real interesting conversation you and I have. Dave Krieg at 48, Mark Brunell at 47, Jim Plunkett at 46, and Billy Kilmer at 45. That is the stratosphere that Matt Hasselbeck lives in. And I think that's right. I mean, you've got a mix of guys who had really high peaks and not a lot of longevity. And then you've got guys who were winners, but didn't do it for long as well. And then you've got somebody like Matt Hasselbeck, who was top 10-ish at the peak of his era, had a lot of success in the postseason, defined himself in Seattle. And I think the spreadsheet has him perfectly. I mean, not that we would disagree with their own formula, but I think
no, not that we would. But I mean, I think that's the other thing is that the thing about him is that if you also look at those guys and what their careers were and their impact were in their respective situations, they're also very similar, right? Fans look at those guys in a very similar way, right? Like the Eagles fans, the way they look at Randall Cunningham is probably very similar to the way that Seahawks fans feel about Matt Hasselbeck. You know, this is a guy who, you know, was your version, you know, the way that like a baseball team feels about a perennial all-star, a perennial Pro Bowler, the guy who could get the job done, the guy who took you through highs and lows. Especially when you look at, you know, what Seattle had been as an organization in the years before Hasselbeck getting there. And this is where I jump in and kind of my favorite, you know, statistic part that I found with him was that Seattle had been in the playoffs 5 times since 1976, which was the founding of their organization as an expansion team. And he takes them to the playoffs 6 times, right? And so that's significant. I mean, that's why the context not only of him being in the top 50 all-time matters, but also just the context of he's the prior to Russell Wilson, of course, you know, in the phenomenal career that he had in Seattle. I think this is kind of fun too, because we'll be able to talk about Russell Wilson in this list eventually. And Hasselbeck, you know, is one era that then led to the Wilson era. And now Seattle is on to another era. And their hope is that the next person takes them a step further, right? Hasselbeck took them to being a perennial playoff contender in their first Super Bowl appearance. Russell Wilson made them a Super Bowl team, you know, and that's what separates these guys from being in the upper echelon and being in top 50. You know, you had a great career, but, you know, wasn't necessarily elite.
So this is Pro Football Reference page, which I always like to show. And this is a great resource for anybody if you want to follow along with what we're talking about. We'll try to dive into it some, but we're not going to make the whole thing just clicking through his reference page. But nickname Mr. August. I never really looked into how he got that nickname. It's always interesting to see the nicknames on here. 6'4", 235 out of Boston College. He threw more interceptions at Boston College than he did touchdowns, 26-22. He was a 6th-round draft pick by the Green Bay Packers and backed up Brett Favre for Mike Holmgren's final 2 years in Green Bay, and then transplanted with Holmgren into Seattle, where he had 2 decent years starting. As we go down through the game logs here, the season logs, 2001, 5-7 record, 2002, 5-5 record, 63% completion, 3,000 yards, 15 touchdowns, 10 picks. This is when he really cemented himself as the starter of the future in Seattle. And then this next following run, Max, is the defining run that basically puts him on this spreadsheet. It is what gets him into the top 50 quarterbacks of the Super Bowl era. It was obviously his run in Seattle, where they had a Super Bowl appearance, 5 straight playoff appearances, 6 playoff appearances total in his time there. And that was the central fulcrum part of his career. And we're looking at it right now. But it started, and this is what I wanted to show you, buddy. We talked about this on the phone earlier, and I think this will launch us into a deeper discussion about how he got to his best season. And I really want to live in that season a little bit. And we have a rewatch of the 2005 NFC Championship game to do. But let me show you this clip, because to me, if I were to pick 3 words to describe him, it would be smart. I want to start with the positives first. Smart, big, and the third word, if I had to pick one, would be awkward. And I don't want that to sound negative, but he was aware of himself. He wasn't trying to be a player that he wasn't. He wasn't trying to be somebody that he's not. And I think self-awareness is a huge skill to have, a massive skill to have. And I think Matt proved that. He was smart on the field. He made good decisions with the football. He was able to run the offense, smart enough to process things. And this clip I'm about to show you, this minute 30, Max, really demonstrates that ability for Matt Hasselbeck. So this is 2002. He is not cemented as Seattle starter. Week 17 in an irrelevant game against the San Diego Chargers. Sean Alexander, who won the MVP a couple years later, was on the cover of Madden once, goes out of the game. They're down by 7. He's got to go 95 yards to score a touchdown. Now, what I'm about to show you is a 3rd down and 11. And what I mean by he was pushing through everything while being just a touch awkward and just a touch gritty is you're going to see at the start of this clip exactly what I'm talking about in the 2 plays that define Matt Hasselbeck as a player. Now, this wasn't peak Matt, but this was early Matt, and this really led to him. So let's go ahead and play.
Charger defense.
So you see Max, he's going to be licking his fingers and stuff, right? He licks the fingers. He just seems nervous. He seems really like jacked up and juiced. And it's 3rd down and 11.
A left high ankle sprain, and he is done for today. And that's a guy you want on the field in a 2-minute situation like this.
He's just constantly, and I know guys lick their fingers, but he's like almost licking his whole face. He's got his palm on his face. 3rd and 11.
4 vertical, no place to go.
And then watch this. He's short. So he just falls to the ground like a doll. And it's 4th and 1. Now they should be calling a timeout.
He's going to have to get everybody lined up or call timeout.
But they're not going to do it. So it's awkward. It's confusing. He's got to grasp control of the situation. It's 4th down and 1, final drive.
Should have called a timeout. He doesn't use it. He's got 18 seconds on the play clock. Ingram is in the slot. He's been good in this situation. Ingram got jammed up, and then goes Hasselbeck, and he got the 1st down. What a play.
1st down. And that, to me,
and then you saw a little bit of the cockiness too.
Yeah, well, he does this smile like, hey, I did that. And then he scored on that drive on a quarterback draw. And it was really obvious. They like emptied out the backfield. The color commentator goes, oh, that's a quarterback draw, and just falls into the end zone. Both of those runs, did that look graceful?
No, absolutely not.
Athletic? Did it? No, it looked flailing. But I think that's why I'm so impressed by him in his career is he had the talent level of Andy Dalton, and almost the awkward type of personality. Yet he was able to perform in really big moments.
Well, and
really,
when the pressure's finally on him to be a starter too, and when he was finally given the keys to the car, I mean, he ran with it. He really did run with it. And the thing, in reference, by the way, the nickname is just as awkward as his career. Mr. August comes from that he was this phenomenal preseason quarterback in Green Bay, because Green Bay's not playing Brett Favre. So that's where that nickname came from that you were referencing earlier. And I think that's just so perfect, because it's like, okay, we know that we have a good quarterback, but we have a great quarterback starting in front of him, so he's never going to see the field. Well, Holmgren goes to Seattle, and now you get your chance, and he literally ran with it, right? And it's so ironic, too, that the first highlights you show are of a guy who literally has no mobility, and he would be probably one of the first real people out there to tell you. But that's the grit and grind that it takes to be a top 50 quarterback. That's the grit and grind that it takes to be a top 100 quarterback in the NFL, is to go out on the field and actually go out and take what's given to you at any given moment. And that's how you have a winning record in this league. I mean, 85 and 75 career quarterback record. And he had a much better even winning percentage, before the middle of his career, and things changed for him a little bit. But that's what he did. He was a gritter and a grinder, and he played on a team that grit and grinded too, because they were never a pass first team while he was in Seattle. But he had some really phenomenal seasons, and when you look into that as he took the role over, and it always starts with earning the job first, and then what do you do with the job? And that's where Hasselbeck really ran with it.
So I want you to take us through, Max. I'm going to pull it up here, that 2005 season.
Sure.
Because you and I really looked at it. I'm pulling it up here for.
Well, it's the greatest 13 game stretch of his career, is what we looked at it as. They went 13-0 in that stretch with him starting. It wasn't a complete winning streak because they rested their starters late in the season, and then they got into the playoffs. But up until that Super Bowl performance, it is by far one of the greatest streaks, especially also, and again, take it with a grain of salt, because remember, the game in 2005 versus the game in 2022, it is absolutely different. I mean, we can't deny that. But in that 13-game winning streak, which started in week 5 on the road at St. Louis, and then concluded, he played a few drives against Green Bay in week 17, but really the streak concluded in the playoffs. If you go look at that first start, that's a great example of absolute elite quarterback play at that time. 37-31 on the road against St. Louis, 71% completion percentage, 316 yards, 2 touchdowns, no picks. Efficient, awesome, great day. And then the irony that I found on this, and you're the one who pointed this out to me, but on this, large breadth of games, the game where he actually had his kind of worst passer rating performance was the game where he was required to throw the most passes. That also defines Hasselbeck's career, right? That is why Matt is not a top 25 quarterback. It's arguably why he didn't win a Super Bowl, is that when you had to give him the keys to the car and grind your way to a victory through the passing attack, that was going to be a major problem. And I'm sure that on tape, that's the game that the Pittsburgh Steelers really looked at to try and find, all right, how can we beat this team that is dominated? Because the other thing on this winning streak that you go look at is that the Seahawks weren't just winning football games. They were really dominant. And Hasselbeck in the regular season had 19 touchdowns and 7 picks in those 11 victories. He had a completion percentage of 66% and a passer rating literally of just barely over 100. If you include his stats from the last game, that was actually, his passer rating was over 100 in that game too before he got benched. But that Cowboys game, I went back and looked at that. And in that game, it was a 13-10 victory for the Seahawks over the Cowboys. And he had to throw the ball 42 times. Well, why did Hasselbeck have to throw the ball 42 times, right? I mean, what changed? What went wrong as far as their ability to move the ball? Sean Alexander, 21 rushes, 61 yards, right? And in the Super Bowl, which we're going to get to a little bit further down the road, though, that is very similar to what the Steelers ended up doing. So that's the reference I take with him, is that when the Seahawks were able to run the ball, when the Seahawks' great defense was given the ability to be aggressive, Hasselbeck was the type of quarterback who could follow through on a blowout. He could put up the points necessary. He threw 4 passing touchdowns against San Francisco. He helped put up 42 points against Philly. And he did a lot of these things in this streak. But if you really look at it, it was a quarterback who was taking what was given to him, not stretching the field intensely. I mean, I'm going to look for this too. I'm very curious about his longest pass of the season during that year, and I'll find that as well. But it's a great 13-game stretch. But truly, the irony too is that for that to be his greatest peak, if that's the greatest that you could ever do in your career, then it also explains why, wow, we think you were a very good NFL quarterback. But if that's your version of elite, then that's very different. And the way that I'll combat that with too is that we've seen people like Matt Flynn's of the world, even the Nick Foles of the world, the Carson Wentz's of the world, right? Some of these other guys who are up and down on this list as well. We've seen them arguably probably have better stretches than this ever in their career too. However, the thing that's very different that I really love about Hasselbeck, because it's the type of person I am. Like, tennis is my game. I'm a grinded out type of person. It's never pretty. Hasselbeck took the winning ugly type of style of play and embraced that, and went on to have a career winning record, went on to win an NFC championship game, went on to play in a Super Bowl, and arguably without injury, which we'll get to in a moment here too, probably could have won a Super Bowl, or definitely at a minimum played in another NFC championship game, and even be a little bit higher up this list.
So I want to comment along the NFC championship game. It's 12 minutes. I don't know if we'll do the whole thing.
Sure.
But I want to watch some of it because it is the biggest game of his career. And it is the signature moment of his career, is making that Super Bowl. This was Seattle's first Super Bowl. Like, this was a massive deal for the fan base, for the Seahawks as a franchise. And you had mentioned the playoff stat earlier that Matt brought the Seahawks to a place they had never been before. Even when Russell Wilson was getting ready to walk through the door in Seattle, all the way back in 2011, they didn't know Russell Wilson existed. None of us really knew Russell Wilson existed at that point. But there was a Bring Back Matt campaign from the Seattle Seahawks fan base. They had no interest in anybody else. And Russell Wilson fell in their lap, and we all know the story from there. But this guy was a hero in a lot of places in Seattle, and he just got inducted into the Ring of Honor recently.
Well, and that's how much goodwill that he created too. His stats over 2008 to 2010, before they decided to move on from him, 34 touchdowns, 44 picks. They went 12-23, but he still had so much goodwill with that fan base that's how badly they wanted to go see him. And also, I mean, in Tennessee, just on an aside, he did go 9-7 with a much better team. So that's a part of it too. He is definitely the type of quarterback where if you put a solid roster around him, they're going to win some football games. They're probably going to win more than they lose. But it's also ironic to see the goodwill that someone who went 12-23 creates, especially in the modern NFL. And this is what's happened in our lifetime over these last 15 seasons, what Tom Brady has done to the NFL and what Nick Saban has done to college football. If you go through a 12-23 run, you're losing your job as a quarterback. You're losing your job as a coach, and people hate you, even if you won a Super Bowl 5 years ago.
Look at Doug Peterson. The dude's coaching the Jaguars after he brought the Eagles a Super Bowl, which if you told somebody in the 70s that's an Eagles fan that they were going to fire the coach that finally won the Eagles a Super Bowl, they'd have shot you in the street in Philly in the 70s.
Ironically, too, it's probably, just on a quick aside, that's probably a better situation for Doug Peterson because now he gets to work with a quarterback with intangibles, which that's another conversation about this list.
See, the rookies and stuff don't get to show up on the spreadsheet. There's a few active players on the spreadsheet, but we're not going to talk about those today. All right, let's watch some of this NFC Championship game. The significant moments in his career. It's going to have some sound, Max, but we need to be talking over it.
Otherwise,
people will be bored. Oh, I love the Fox music. Always gets me going. Here comes
it's just prime time, baby. Well, the other fun thing about this is you're talking about one of the greatest atmospheres for playoff football in the NFL too.
Oh, without a doubt.
Oh, that's a fun start, isn't it? So I'm fairly certain that this is where you were watching this and told me that this is going to be a dart.
Oh yeah, look at this.
Yeah.
I mean, unbelievable. I don't know how the quality's coming through on the stream. For us, it's a little jumpy, but that's why we're not going to watch the whole thing. But these are defining throws, and he's just first drive dots.
That's pure adrenaline, isn't it? Like you just go out there and start dropping in darts like that.
And he's like shoving the ball. Like it's not natural. It's all grit and just I'm gonna.
It really is. It's shot put. It's just.
And he doesn't have this naturally great arm. Like honestly, I bet if we did an arm ranking of the top 50 quarterbacks, he might be 49th or 50th.
Well, you know what's interesting too about Hasselbeck, and I'm glad we can talk about this while we're taking a peek at this. He was not a guy who took risks on deep passes actually until later in his career. Because I think that's also something in the NFL that, you talk about percentages and turnovers and this and that. I mean, his longest passes in Seattle were 60, 56, 72, 65, 34, 53. Then all of a sudden, late in his career, it's 87, 80, 77, 77.
Now, do you know who this is?
No,
on the other side?
Julius Peppers?
No, the quarterback on the other side.
Jake Delhomme.
Yeah, Jake the Snake, baby. This is a year after their Super Bowl. Oh, horrid throw. What a horrid throw. Did you see how many Seahawks were around that ball?
Boy, if you also want to talk about a team that I think would have been very different without. Imagine if you put Matt Hasselbeck on that Carolina Panthers team, for example.
With Steve Smith.
I mean, that would have been so different. Jake the Snake was not it. We've got the spinning wheel of death here. At least I do.
No, I have the
okay.
It says experiencing interruptions. Find out why. Well, it's
that's where I want to get
things at once.
But that's where I want to get with Matt Hasselbeck, though, is that when we go away from the statistics, I think the really fun thing about him is that you go and look at what they did in 2005. It was by far his most productive season. He had the highest passer rating in the NFC that year, so that's one of those league leader categories. So that's talking about things outside of the wins and losses. And then, if you really begin to look at what he did that season in the realm of the league, he was, arguably an MVP candidate. 24 touchdown passes, only 9 interceptions. He protected the ball very well. Yards per attempt was 7.7, which was a career high for him as a starter. So that's a real accomplishment. And then he also had, 2 fourth quarter comebacks that were both game-winning drives. He was a Pro Bowler. That was his second Pro Bowl. He was a Pro Bowler in 2003 as well. But that was really supposed to be. And I think this is where it gets interesting to look at his career. That 2005 season, he's 30 years old. And the way that quarterbacks in this modern era have been, that's supposed to be the launching pad, the middle of your peak. And really what happened is in 2006, they had a really hot start and Hasselbeck got hurt. It was his worst injury in his football playing career. They were 4-1. He got seriously injured in week 7. And you talk about the fact that this guy's a little bit awkward. He blamed it on EJ Henderson, who rolled into his leg. Very similar to the Carson Palmer injury. I mean, that was becoming a lot more common, these MCL and ACL injuries. And we also were not at a point where that was a roughing the passer penalty either. And his career was really changed by that. I mean, it is impossible to acknowledge that it wasn't. But even with all of that happening in that season, he returned with broken fingers on his non-throwing hand. He continued to lead him to a 9-7 season in the divisional round. And then he took him on what would end up being a game-winning drive, although Tony Romo should have tied it, but dropped the snap. That was against Matt Hasselbeck, 21-20. And then they really should have beaten the Bears, and they should have been on their way to their next to their next Super Bowl, right? They were in. That was the. I got to double check now. Was that the NFC Championship game in 2006 as well? Now I'm kind of
no. I think it was a round short from that.
So it would have been I think that no. That was the NFC Championship game. It was the Seattle. So after winning or after
making the Super Bowl,
after making the Super Bowl in 2005, the 2006
The
Seattle
worst
Seahawks.
the
You're
worst
right.
officiated
It
Super
was
Bowl of all time.
You're right. It was the divisional round, which they lost in overtime to the Chicago Bears, and arguably in a game that they should have won. And so he almost had them in back-to-back NFC Championship games, even with his worst injury luck of his career. But then when you start to look at the numbers and his efficiencies and his yards per attempt and his turnovers, I mean, that's where it really changed because, the next season he had statistically a solid year, but his yards per attempt numbers were down. His ability downfield was down. He had his biggest yardage season, but when you watch him on tape, that's when, and if you read some of the articles that I'm referencing here, thanks to Wikipedia and their little resources that I hop to, that's really where scouts felt like too within the organization that he changed. But there's also that question, right, that begs, like, they still went 10-6. He threw for the most yards ever in his career the next season after that injury, 28 touchdowns, 12 picks. The league was changing a little bit, becoming even more passer friendly. But was that confidence factor shaken in large part because the organization felt that way? And that's always kind of a curious factor to me too. But yeah, that injury really changed things for him. And again, he should have been flowing into this huge peak. And then all of a sudden the drop off comes 2008, 2009, 2010. Didn't have a winning quarterback record until Tennessee gave him the keys to the car for a full 16-game season in 2011, and they went 9-7.
Well, then he backed up Andrew Luck there for a little bit too at the end in Indianapolis. So
yeah, and he's played in 2012, and then he was on the team in 13 and 14, and then he started 8 games in 2015 at 40 years old and still went 5-3 with 9 touchdowns and 5 picks.
Yeah, the Colts have a weird knack with these older quarterbacks. I mean, Phillip Rivers didn't even move in the pocket, and they were winning games with him. So I think Matt Ryan's the best they've had in a while, but that's modern football talk. We're asking these 3 questions. So the one we just answered, what moments did they miss or fail that hurt their place in the formula? That would be the injury in 2006.
Absolutely.
I think that if he has another year of the statistical accumulation, which, a reminder, this is the formula. So again, if he's top 10 in yards per attempt, top 10 in passing touchdowns, top 10 in passer rating, again, that's counted up real quick, 10, 14 points. That gets him up to 157. And then that doesn't even count the accumulation effect of not being injured for that year. So he could have got to the 170s, 180s, could have snuck up, which if he gets to 170 points in the formula, he gets to Greg Morton, Roman Gabriel territory, which is just touching the top 40. And he starts to sniff Tony Romo, who many Cowboys fans have a very, very high opinion of. So
who many people in football think Tony Romo is going to be a Hall of Fame quarterback.
Oh yeah. And he might be.
So
that's the what moments, but we've got 2 more questions to answer, and we said 30 minutes, and we're going to do as close to damn 30 minutes as possible.
Yes, absolutely.
You and I talk each other's ears off. What could have been if everything went right for Matt Hasselbeck? So this is many, many things. You can take this question wherever you want, Max. What could have been if everything went right?
And where I'm going to go with this question is he landed in the best situation probably that could have existed for him. I think that this truly is his peak. I think if you remove the injury, then like you referenced, he might get up to 170. But if he doesn't get drafted by a Packers team that's coached by Holmgren, and Holmgren doesn't identify him and really kind of be a mentor to him and then take him with him to Seattle, I don't think that he has an NFL career anywhere close to this. So I think that this is it's going to be probably one of the few quarterbacks in the top 50 that I think is close to their peak. Take the injury out, and maybe he wins a Super Bowl, and that changes things a little bit. But this is about as high as he could have gone, I think.
Yeah. Damn, that was a good answer. Because I was going to go, hey, if he won the Super Bowl, he'd have climbed up to the 170s. But you're right. If you can only climb up to the 170s, 180s, when we're changing a game result and a major injury, you kind of are at your
You pretty much peaked. You
pretty much peaked. Because, I can go through Peyton Manning's career and I can find 250 points on that spreadsheet.
Absolutely.
That he could have added, that Tom Brady stripped away, that these things, there are so
that he stripped away from himself. But I don't think Hasselbeck has that at all.
No, he doesn't have that, what could have been aspect of him. But that's why I almost like him. Which is the next question. If you had to describe the player in 60 seconds, how would you? You can describe it in less than 60 seconds if you like. Time starts now?
Well, I think that he's a grinder. I think that he's, the type of dude who could probably have some success on Wall Street or as an accountant if he wasn't a football player, which is probably what you're looking for mostly in your quarterbacks. And I think that he was, for me, in my childhood, an awesome, fun guy to root for when you knew you definitely didn't root for the other team he was playing, right? Like that Steelers Super Bowl. I had no qualms with rooting for Matt Hasselbeck. In fact, he was a very likable guy. So that's the other fun part, is that he definitely was never a heel. He wasn't necessarily a hero either, but he was definitely more a protagonist than an antagonist. I think that's how you put it. He was more a protagonist than an antagonist, and I kind of like him for that.
Yeah. So if I were to give it my 60 seconds on Matt Hasselbeck, he is the Seattle Super Bowl pioneer, and his status in the city of Seattle should be forever elevated because of that. He is the first Seahawks quarterback to lift an NFC championship trophy, an organization that's gotten quite used to that over the last decade in being hyper competitive. Matt Hasselbeck was the reason, the stability that brought the Seahawks into being one of the top 5 organizations, probably top 8 organizations in the NFL. You can credit Holmgren, you can credit Sean Alexander, but we all know it's the damn quarterback. And Hasselbeck went in there as a guy who did not have a lot of natural talent, as a guy who did not have everything you would want, 6th-round pick, more interceptions than touchdowns in his college career, little awkward, not a great arm, and he was smart and had the moxie and gritted it out, like you said, and he pushed through all that and led a team and won games and did everything in his power to make the Seahawks the best team it could be with him under center, and he accomplished that, and he peaked as a player. And to do that and to reach the top 50, I mean, that's what you set out to do. Hey, I'm going to be the best player I can be, and Matt certainly did that. He was the best player he could be at in the NFL at quarterback. He is a top 50 quarterback, just above Cam Newton, which is where some of the debates would start with Cam Newton fans going absolutely crazy. Oh, he had an MVP 15-1 in 2015 and lost the Super Bowl. That was a better year. But again, we just plugged the numbers in. So argue with the spreadsheet and not us. And a Seattle all-timer. I think if we're going to put one thing on Matt, he is a Seattle Ring of Honor player, and he is critical to that franchise's history and will be forever. There is no Matt Hasselbeck disappearing, right? Let's pretend that there's a quarterback 20 years from now that wins 8 Super Bowls. Russell Wilson disappears in the narrative of the Seahawks a touch, not a ton, obviously, but being the first guy, being the pioneer, that's going to elevate him so much for the rest of his life.
Well, and he's the type of quarterback that every organization needs to be able to say, hey, son, I love the Seahawks. We live here in Seattle. We live here in Washington. Or shoot, you live in the middle of nowhere in Texas and your parents grew up in Seattle. If you have a quarterback like that on the team, that's also the type of player that allows you to introduce that team to your kids at the time and makes you love them. So you're absolutely right about that, is that it's someone that you're willing to root for. He makes your team more competitive, not less competitive. And there are some guys that I think on this list, when we get to him, we'll say, I don't know if he actually added value to his teams or if he just was, lucky enough to be on some really great squads. But Matt Hasselbeck definitely added to every organization he was at, even in Tennessee and Indianapolis late in his career. And you also have that to go on too. And
there was no waste in Matt. And I really like that. I really like that in the formula. That's Matt Hasselbeck. That is the number 50 quarterback of all time, Max. We did it. We did it. 50, number 5. Number 50. Sorry, not number 5. Number 5 would be way too high, and there would be a major problem with those.
We would have to really reevaluate things.
I would be like, all right.
But Matt Hasselbeck, if you see this, we'd love to have you on and chat with you about your career. This was very interesting. I think that he would like where he sits, because I don't know if many people think of him as a top 50 guy. Well, so I think that people would like this.
I think Seattle fans would like this because of the guys we have him in front of. I mean, a reminder, Matt Hasselbeck is sitting in front of 4 MVPs in this spreadsheet because of the totality of his career, because of the amount he was a consistent top 10 quarterback in this league.
And a consistent winner. A winner.
Ahead of, again, Cam Newton, Drew Bledsoe, Steve McNair. He wouldn't be ahead of Bledsoe if Tom Brady hadn't ruined that season for Drew, but whatever. Steve McNair, Brad Johnson, Joe Flacco. He's ahead of Carson Palmer. and there's a couple other MVPs, Burt Jones, Brian Sipe, I believe MVPs he's ahead of as well. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the start of our top 50. Matt Hasselbeck, the number 50 quarterback in our ranking, got everything he could get out of his damn career, and he was fully himself, and he fully belongs in our top 50. Max, ton of fun.
Yeah, great stuff. Thanks, Lucas. Appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate you. That was a lot of research. We do this all the time.
That was a lot of stuff. That's fun.
I wanted
Makes
to watch
like Matt Hasselbeck even more.
Yeah,
and I'm gonna watch a lot more of that, and I suggest other people do too, because it's fun. It's fun to watch those people.
Oh yeah, I wish we could have watched more of the NFC Championship game, but we'll figure that out all in the future. It was fun. We hope you enjoyed it. We hope you enjoyed the breakdown of the number 50 quarterback of all time. This might be the longest breakdown of Matt Hasselbeck that exists on YouTube. So Seahawks fans, what's up? How you doing?